This week on The Perfect Scam.
You own the barrels. They're stored in a bonded warehouse, generally in the vicinity of the distillery. It's your property, and typically what you do is you sell it either back to the distillery, and then they bottle it for you and put their label on it. Some bottles can sell for hundreds of thousands of dollars, if it's the right bottle.
Do you remember how you felt when you bought the whiskey?
I started thinking, okay, this is my future. This is my Social Security. This is my nest egg for 6 or 8 years.
Welcome back to The Perfect Scam. I'm your host, Bob Sullivan. When we think of investments, we usually think of stocks and bonds, maybe even real estate. But there are many different kinds of investments, like today's topic, whiskey. After all, whiskey often increases in value over time. Now, all investing carries risk, but these kinds of non-traditional investments really do come with some extra hazards. Never invest in something you don't understand and you haven't fully researched. Because, as you'll see, scams can lurk many places, even at the bottom of a whiskey barrel. But make sure you're sitting down for the end of this story, perhaps with a tasty beverage of your choosing, because it's not something I ever recall happening on The Perfect Scam before. Tell me, before we get to our story, are you or have you been a whiskey drinker?
I remain just moderate level drinker.
Mm-hmm.
I'm still learning to appreciate the variety of whiskey.
That's Ray Stiefel of Ithaca, New York, one of those bad at being retired adults who is always looking for interesting opportunities and interesting stories.
I just like the lore. I like just the stories behind the creation of whiskey and the various techniques that are used. It's just very interesting. That's what really allured me into the whiskey investing side of things. It's just the lore of the industry.
An ounce of whiskey is hours of stories, right?
Yes, it really is. There are something in the neighborhood of 120, 130 separate distilleries in Scotland. There's the islands, which includes Islay, which is a big producing area. There's Speyside. There's the Highlands. There's the Lowlands. There's Campbelltown. There's 5. So I think those are the 5 main ones. But the fact that whiskey in Scotland and Ireland takes 3 years to be able to be legally called whiskey, 3 years in a barrel before it's called whiskey. Before that, it's called new make spirits. So it's a 3-year process just to get the label of whiskey. In the United States, with bourbon and Tennessee whiskey, it's 2 years because of the weather and other conditions. But there's all these little bits of trivia that I find fascinating.
Ray's not the only one. Scotland is now teeming with smaller distilleries as interest in classic small batch whiskey is experiencing a bit of a renewal. Some of them have been sort of reborn with old recipes, but with new families, right?
True, very true. The real estate and the buildings are still there. Sometimes they would go into non-use. But yeah, I think with the increased interest in whiskey these days, some of them are being renovated and put back into production.
And as with all growing industries, there is an ever-present need for investors.
Well, in simple terms, the distilleries are interested in recouping their costs, their production costs, as quickly as possible, because a good whiskey might take 8, 10, 12, 15 years before it can be bottled and sold. And that's a whole long time to be holding on to a liquid in a barrel that's evaporating.
But this is not like buying a stock that might pay you a dividend or something you could sell next week if you change your mind. You're in it for the long haul, right?
Definitely, yes. Yes. In the industry, they call it your exit strategy. And that is the distillery's permission. Well, you own the barrels. They're stored in a bonded warehouse, generally in the vicinity of the distillery. and you're holding on. It's yours if it's done legitimately. It's your property. And when you want to sell it, or you can have the barrel shipped to your house if you'd like to. You can even bottle it yourself. But typically, what you do is you sell it either back to the distillery and then they bottle it for you and put their label on it, or some other conglomerate can buy up barrels and use it for blended whiskey.
But you buy a barrel.
Yes.
And I mean, I suppose if you want to, you could go visit your barrel, right?
Yes. And taste it.
And taste it. Remarkable. So, whiskey investors actually own barrels of whiskey stored in a facility somewhere, often in Scotland. And it's possible to go visit the barrel you own, to even taste it as it's sitting there aging. But is this a thing regular people really do? That sounds almost like a hobby for rich people to me. But first of all, just roughly, how much, I mean, I know the cost can vary, but like, how much could I buy a barrel of whiskey for?
I would say the average price is probably around $5,000.
So not an obscene amount of money. And if people take that barrel of whiskey and bottle it, I mean, how many bottles comes out of a barrel of whiskey roughly?
So it's usually bottled into what's called a fifth or a liter. You can buy whiskey in typically, several different size bottles, but I would say that the average barrel would hold maybe 250 liters, something like that.
So if you get 250 bottles out of a barrel,
yes,
and it's $50 a bottle, that's $12,500.
Yes.
And you paid $5,000, and that's
yes.
in 3 years.
No, that's probably a little bit more because
more like 6 or 7 years.
Yeah, it might be more. Again, the really high quality whiskey, they might want to hang on to a little bit more because it actually kind of like wine. I mean, some wines improve over age and some wines don't. But you're correct. Those are the ballpark.
So this isn't just for fun. Yeah. Real money. People make real money doing this, right?
Yes. And some bottles can sell for hundreds of thousands of dollars, if it's the right bottle.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Okay, so how does a person go about buying a barrel of whiskey, investing in whiskey?
Typically, you don't buy barrels directly from the distillery. You buy through a broker because the distilleries don't want to bother with all the paperwork and all of that. So I was given a call from the representative of a whiskey broker about mid-afternoon. And yeah, I was building a house.
Building a house? Now you're going to have to explain that. Ray was building a house. I told you he's a bad retired person. During the tail end of COVID, which he planned to sell with a friend. That's another investment.
Yes. Well, I have some building skills and I have friends that have building skills. And I thought, well, our workload has decreased because of COVID. Let's do this, within the group where we were all carefully vaccinated. And there were 5 of us. I was the primary financier. And the 5 of us took us about 2 or 3 years to build a house because all of us were looking for work, having been unemployed because of COVID.
Wow. So this was the house that you built and sold?
Yes.
Wow. But during a break while working on the house, he gets a call from someone who says he's a broker for whiskey firms.
I got a cold call from an individual who said, I understand you're interested in investing. And I had been investing in the stock market. And that was all, never commodities, always in the stock market. And we spoke about it, and he was very professional.
So this guy calls, he has an accent?
Yes, he did. He had a British accent.
Did he seem well-spoken? Did he seem young, old?
He seemed maybe in his 30s and well-spoken, well-educated, and well-versed in investing in barrels of whiskey.
So how long did you talk to him?
Probably half an hour.
And where did you leave it at the end of that first phone call?
We left it that I would be contacted by another individual who was an actual sales broker.
And sure enough, about a week later, another man with an accent calls and says his name is Casey Alexander. Do you remember anything about the sound of his voice?
I couldn't quite place whether he was Irish or English.
Hmm.
And I guess he's mostly Irish, but he's lived in England for a long time. So he definitely had an accent from that part of the world.
Sure. Also seemed in his 30s or something like that.
Yes. Yeah.
And also very well versed in the whiskey business.
Absolutely. Yeah. Very professional.
In between these phone calls, Ray had started to weigh the idea of investing in whiskey, and, well, it held a certain allure for him. Did you Google whiskey investing or do some research or anything like that?
Very little.
Hmm.
Very little. I was not at all familiar with all the different brands and labels and types of whiskey. My grandparents were Irish. There was often a little bit of Irish whiskey during family celebration. So I was familiar with the product.
So Ray goes back and forth with Casey for a few weeks, and eventually he decides to take the plunge. Well, more like take a sip. He buys 6 barrels of whiskey, which is basically the minimum.
He sent me an invoice for my first purchase. I'm going to say it was 6 barrels. So it was probably closer to $30,000.
Okay. But 6 barrels of whiskey, that sounds like a moderate step into this thing.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
Do you remember how you felt when you bought the whiskey?
I started thinking, oh, okay, this is my future. This is my Social Security. This is my nest egg for 6 or 8 years hence. I'll be able to sell this. And he didn't give me specific numbers, but I had the impression that I would probably double my money.
Double the money in 6 or 8 years. Now, that's hardly an outrageous estimate. An investment that grows 10% every year doubles every 7 years. And by the way, an investment that grows 7% doubles every 10 years. It's what's known as the 7-10 rule in investing. It's just math. Anyway, so Ray is thinking of a few barrels of whiskey that can help him diversify his portfolio. Plus, but also, it strikes me, it's kind of unsatisfying when you buy stocks, isn't it? Whereas, you just bought barrels of whiskey. That seems kind of fun.
Yes, yeah, because I did end up visiting a lot of distilleries. So you could actually, as you said earlier, visit and knock on wood, literally, your own barrel.
Okay, that's getting ahead of ourselves. Perhaps it should come as no surprise that after that initial $30,000 6-barrel investment, Ray got a real taste for, well, that's Scotch whiskey. So when Casey calls again, about a month later,
he said, the whiskey you have purchased, some of it was aged 4 years or 6 years already. So it could already be bottled and marketed. He said, if you wanted to diversify a little bit, you can buy newer whiskey. You can buy whiskey from a different distillery.
Diversify even more, Casey recommends. Ray is hooked.
He could sense my interest, my curiosity, my enthusiasm, and he would call me maybe once a month with some new offerings, because each distillery they decide when they will bottle their barrels. And so it's like laddering. When you purchase stock, sometimes you ladder, buying it at different times to smooth out the ups and downs of the market.
Mm-hmm.
You can buy whiskey in a similar way. You can buy a variety of whiskeys, and you can buy whiskeys from different areas, different techniques, different types of barrels. So there's a lot of variety, and he would just offer me different options to diversify my investments.
So each month for several months, Ray buys another set of barrels. Pretty soon, his whiskey tasting investment has swelled into 6 figures. And as Ray's curiosity swells, he decides he's going to visit Scotland, see the distillery business for himself. And along the way, he can meet his new friend and fellow whiskey enthusiast, Casey Alexander.
I was on my way to Scotland. Actually, my intention was to visit some of these distilleries into which I had invested money. Mm-hmm. And I was transiting through London, and I had a couple of hours. So I had contacted Casey and asked him, maybe we could meet. And he said, sure. So I flew into London. I had about a 4-hour layover before continuing on to Scotland. And he sent a car to pick me up at the airport. The car brought me to a nice restaurant in London where I met Casey. We had a nice meal together. He was very professional, very well dressed, very well spoken. I'm about 6'3". He was probably 5'11". Well, he had a well-trimmed beard. He was really, he presented really well. Every time I saw him, he was wearing a suit.
I mean, was he funny? Did you have a good chat?
We did. Yeah, we did. He talked about his girlfriend. We talked about a little bit about his family, a little bit about my family. Yeah, it was very personable. It was very personal.
He felt like a friend at this point?
Yes, he did. Very quickly, he felt like a friend who was, really trying to help me out. They make you feel like they're going out of their way. You're special. They're going to help you out, do special things for you. And then his driver took me back to the airport for my ongoing flight.
So Ray goes on to visit Scotland, and he's really hooked now. But his trip leaves him a bit unsatisfied because... But did you go visit your barrels during this trip?
No, because at that point, none of the distilleries were in the area of where the distilleries were that I had invested in. Now, because of COVID, some of the distilleries are not open to the public. Some of them are on reduced hours. There was one called Tullibardine, which is a whiskey quite near Glasgow. And I drove by it, but it said not open to the public. So no, we never visited any of my barrels. Nope.
Ray owns these barrels, but he cannot visit them. So naturally, he plans another trip a few months later. And that's even more fun, in part because he gets to spend much more time with Casey.
And the second time I met Casey, very fancy restaurant. One of the tallest buildings in London is called the Shard. And it looks like a shard of glass, glass. And the restaurant was at the very top, the invitation only. He had 2 other people there with him, and the 4 of us sat around and sampled different whiskeys and had little bites to eat. So it was his budget, his expense budget must have been a pretty fat one.
After lunch, Ray takes off across the UK for Scotland again, but this time, Casey agrees to meet him there.
I had a rental car, so I picked him up in a town where we had agreed to meet. We just spent the day together. We went to 2 or 3 distilleries. He bought me lunch at a modest restaurant, and he seemed very knowledgeable. He claimed to know some of the people at those distilleries, even though he didn't introduce me to anybody. But he had lots of questions to the tour guide, because when you go to a distillery, you often go on a tour. He had a lot of interesting, and obviously coming from a well-educated person, a lot of questions for the tour guide.
So he certainly sounded like he was in the business.
Yes. Yeah.
But
he also had he had taken a very serious course in whiskey production, and from which he claimed he got a certificate, but he sent me pictures. I think he actually went to this seminar. It was a multi-day educational seminar to learn more about different kinds of whiskey and just to be more informed. And he sent me a picture of him at this seminar. So I think that was valid.
To give you an idea of these tours, Casey has a very slick video he produced of a tour. Here's a part of it.
Coming here in most tours I do, it really just always reaffirms my love affair with whiskey. I mean, you've got the art of making it, you've got the science in making it, the history, from Prohibition through to World Wars and everything else. And that's before you've even drank the stuff. So, today I just feel extremely inspired by this whole process, this whole business, the beauty of everything involved.
So you can understand, by the time Ray gets home from this trip, well, he feels great about his ongoing investments with Casey. So about how many of these purchases did you make over the course of a year or so?
Probably, I'm going to say 15.
And were they all in the $20,000 range or so? Or
Yes. Yeah. Because typically you buy in a lot, and a lot is 6 barrels.
Okay.
So 6-barrel lots is kind of the typical purchase. And when you're offered whiskey, sometimes they require, because they don't want to deal with people just buying 1 or 2 barrels. So they will sell them in lots of 6 barrels.
So at this point, Ray has invested about $300,000 with Casey during the past year or so. And perhaps it's no surprise, Ray starts looking into diversifying even more, buying from other distilleries that Casey doesn't represent. Ray even makes a 3rd trip to Scotland, and that trip, well, it's very different from his trips with Casey.
I flew back again through London, but this time I was looking into another broker, and I called them up and I said, I'm interested in investing. Could I come visit? And they said, sure. And they picked me up and they brought me to their office. There was no food involved. There was whiskey tasting involved, but there was no food involved. And I met all the principals of the business, and they showed me their extensive collection of whiskey. So I felt very solid about that.
But suddenly, not so solid about Casey. Remember, Ray and Casey had those fancy lunches, even visited distilleries, but Ray had never met the owners of any of the places he'd invested in, and he'd never even met the barrels of whiskey. At this point, his concerns are still sort of vague, but only a few hundred miles away from Ithaca, someone else in the U.S. is suddenly becoming very concerned with whiskey investments.
My name is Brian McDonough, and I'm an assistant United States attorney in Cleveland, Ohio.
And what is your territory?
So we cover the northern district of Ohio, which is the northern 40 counties in the state of Ohio. We have offices in Cleveland, Akron, Youngstown, and Toledo.
And in those Ohio offices, there's a wee trickle of scam complaints coming in about investment opportunities involving liquor. One catches Brian's eye. It sounds way too familiar.
We had a local referral from one of our local police departments of a victim who had invested money in wine and in whiskey. And it was referred to a local department that referred it to some of our local law enforcement and community partners. And what we found out was that this scam was actually a repeat of a scam that had occurred in the mid-1990s in California.
It was a remake.
It was a remake.
Oh my God.
There's the movie The Sting where Robert Redford and Paul Newman, and they have the horse race, the posting, the post action of running a horse race, and it had that same flavor that we called that The Wire. But in this case, the repeat of the scam was that there was rare champagne from France that was stored in bunkers, World War II bunkers outside of London. And there was an opportunity to purchase this champagne. It was rare. It would only appreciate in value. And as it turns out, it was a scam. There were no bunkers. There was no champagne. So that was the first inkling that this scam that started off with wine and then actually evolved into whiskey was the first inkling that something was wrong, that this was a repeat on a classic scam.
So Brian and his team start doing their research, and they quickly find there's more than a trickle of complaints about liquor investments coming in from all over.
Yes, we then looked to see across the country were there other reports of it. And in fact, there were other state regulatory entities that were looking at these suspect companies purporting to sell wine and whiskey. And there were numerous complaints across the country.
And many of the complaints name the same salesman, Casey Alexander. So Brian and his team decide they need to dig into the case. But at the moment, they have a very big problem. Casey Alexander And everyone else seemingly involved in this scam is in the UK. They can't go arrest them there, so they devise a plan to bring Casey to the US. There's a reason Brian dropped mention of the movie The Sting earlier.
Casey was from the United Kingdom and actually flown from London to the United States to meet with investors in person. It was one thing to be able to get investors to have an opportunity to just talk with them on the phone, but to really get large-scale investments, having someone in person would help the scam. So Casey came over and met in person with various investors.
So the FBI speaks to another victim and asks, "Can you lure Casey to come to the US?"
So we had, the way it worked is we had a victim investor ended up introducing Casey to another purported investor, and that investor was actually an undercover here in Cleveland. And then through a series of text messages, Casey ended up coming to Cleveland to meet with this purported investor who was an undercover, and Casey had an opportunity to describe the investment into whiskey.
Casey thinks he's flying to the US to land a big investment, but instead, he's been lured by a victim who connected Casey with an undercover agent. But the FBI doesn't arrest Casey right as he gets off the plane. The feds want even more solid evidence of the crime. So
he was actually in Cleveland, and the meeting was set up. And after he had met with the undercover, there was a follow-up meeting after that. And Casey Alexander was arrested in downtown Cleveland en route to another meeting.
you guys actually did set up a fake horse betting salon for him.
That really would have been a Hollywood setting on it. But considering the gravity and the scope, at this point, Casey was the front person in the United States for this investment scam. Mm-hmm. His name was on the bank accounts. He was the face of this investment opportunity. If investors went to a website, they saw him on the website. So the ability to take him down was very gratifying.
Was he surprised? Was he, resistant, or how did it go?
For the actual takedown, he was shocked and surprised as well. When he was arrested, he came and gave up the whole story. He took a responsibility, and when questioned by the FBI about his role and what he did, he took responsibility and admitted exactly what he was doing.
Brian meets Casey later the day of the arrest, and he is struck by mixed feelings. Okay, so they brought him into your offices.
Correct. He was arrested on a complaint, and he was brought in that very day. And I looked and saw him and thought, how can this young kid be involved in an international wine and whiskey fraud conspiracy?
A young kid, was he tall, lanky? Did he look scared?
Tall, thin, good-looking, had a British accent, was respectful, courteous, was intelligent, and spoke very well.
It sounds like you felt a little sorry for him that day.
It's a mixture. One is to get justice for victims, and that means just stopping the fraud itself. And yet, at the same time, in any case where you're prosecuting a fraudster, I think part of the thought is, what led them to this? How did they end up on this path? How could someone who obviously was very personable, very likable, the ability to create instant rapport with people such as Ray, how do they end up choosing a life of dishonesty? That there were obviously others involved. He was not the only one. He was not the mastermind of the operation, but that he admitted what he did was wrong. He was a young, opportunistic kid who was looking for a way to better himself financially. And this area of investing in whiskey or in wine was kind of a gray area when it came to Europe. It wasn't a highly regulated industry. So in this space, he looked at it as an opportunity to go ahead and make some money and better himself.
The arrest of a man running a classic scam, but updated for the whiskey renaissance age, hits the local news, and Ray spots the story.
The article said, how did it go? Young whiskey scammer steals $13 million from investors, something like that.
And who was the young whiskey scammer?
Casey.
It's the Casey you knew.
Yeah.
Was there a picture of him in the story?
I'm going to say no, but I knew that it had to be him.
You knew it had to be him. What did that feel like?
Like a punch to the stomach.
God, it's terrible. I mean, You must have had some reaction, like there's got to be some mistake, right?
Yeah. That's why I started calling the distilleries. About, within a couple of days, I would imagine I started calling. Yeah, it was a time of panic.
And in that panic, he starts to call the distillers that are supposedly holding his investments.
I had a list of all the barrels that I had from this one distillery. It might have been 10 or 12 at that point from this one distillery. I called them up, and I had barrel numbers, and I spoke to the manager of the distillery, and I said, I just want to verify that these barrels exist. And I gave him the numbers, and he said, no, that's not our numbering system. No, we don't have any barrels with those numbers. When they said, no, there's no such numbering system in our warehouse, then I realized what had happened, and that I had lost. I thought, well, maybe I lost some of my money. Maybe it was just this one distillery. But I pretty quickly confirmed that all of it was a scam.
God, that's just terrible.
Yeah.
Did you try to reach out to Casey?
Yes, I did. And initially, the company remained reachable by phone in London, and he was always, too busy or not available. There was also a representative here in the States who I believe subsequently was also named as a scammer, and I couldn't reach him. So very quickly, I could not reach anybody. They still had people in the office, but I didn't unload on them because I figured they were unaware of what was going on.
Ray is now worried that all his investments, some 15 sets of 6 barrels of whiskey worth supposedly $300,000, well, it's all a fraud. So what does a person do in that situation?
What did I do? At some point, I called Brian McDonough. He's very supportive. He did say, don't expect to get any of your money back.
How did you find him?
Let me think. He might have been named in one of the articles.
Okay, got it, yeah. So now they have Casey in custody, but he's still a UK citizen. So that makes prosecuting the crime very complicated. So what kind of complexities did that create for the case?
For the case, it was a little challenging because in the federal system, there are only 2 options available, and those options include being detained, being in custody, or being permitted on bond. Well, the logistics of having him on bond would have him go back to the United Kingdom would be difficult. So the logistics of it was that he was ordered to be released on bond, but he had a geographic restriction in being required to remain in the district. So he remained in the Northern District of Ohio during the pendency of his case.
It takes about a year to work through the case. And during that time, Brian starts reaching out to all the victims. Okay, so once he pleads guilty, then you start reaching out to more victims. And so did you talk directly to Ray?
Yes, I talked to Ray throughout the pendency of the case. Ray had a unique connection. He spent a lot of time talking with Casey, and I had the pleasure of just spending a lot of time talking with Ray as well on it.
After more than a year of procedural wrangling, Casey pleads guilty. Ray makes the trip for sentencing. And that's where you'll find the surprise ending I've promised you.
I drove to Cleveland, which from Ithaca is about a 4-hour drive. And coincidentally, that's where I went to university.
So you know it, yeah.
So I drove from Ithaca, and I went to the courthouse, and I met Brian. I met some of the FBI agents. And finally, Casey walked in. I hadn't seen him except for those 2 times. And he didn't make eye contact with me. He walked right to the defendant table. The defendants were on one side, and the district attorney, the prosecutors were on another side, and the judge, who was a very nice guy.
Ray is there to have his say.
I mean, everybody seemed fine. Asked some questions, and at some point, he said, "I understand there's somebody here who would like to give a victim statement," and that was myself. So I got to stand up at a little microphone, and I told the judge and others my experience. There wasn't a jury because he was already guilty. He already claimed to be guilty. I just said how it affected me, my finances. It was a blow to my finances, but I'll be okay. But it hurt. And also my lack of trust in people. Like, I really thought I had trusted this guy. I thought he was a friend. And then he did this to me. So I made a couple of remarks. I spoke for a couple of minutes about my experience as a victim of this scam.
Because of the particulars of the case, namely Casey's UK citizenship, the judge orders Casey to leave the country and pay partial restitution to the victims. And then something remarkable happens.
The interesting thing is, as the court ended and I stood up and talked again to some of the people, Casey walked by with his lawyers. He looked at me and stopped, and it looked like he had a pained expression on his face. And he reached out. He was close enough to reach out to shake my hand. And at that point, I was kind of feeling a little bit sorry for him. I mean, here's a guy, I think he was in his late 20s, and he really messed up his life. Even though I'm not 100% sure at what point he knew it was a scam. I don't know. Nobody knows how culpable he really is, except the fact that he sold things that didn't exist. We shook hands, and he looked at me, and he was kind of tearing up a little bit. And he stepped forward and gave me a big hug. And he said, "I'm really sorry. I didn't know this was happening." And then he walked away.
Wow.
Yeah.
I mean, that's just something that never happens in the stories that we do here on the podcast, that the victim and the criminal have a hug.
I received it. I accepted it. I didn't push him away. I didn't hit him in the head. I just thought, this guy, he's young. He was well-trained, mostly self-trained. And I think it could be that he was really looking forward to a long career in whiskey. And the people he was representing had other intentions. So I still don't know. I may never know. But it could be that he was completely innocent and is paying the price of his future.
And by completely innocent, it's possible you think that he was a salesperson who really thought there were whiskey barrels. He was unaware that there were no barrels.
That's a possibility.
Brian is bowled over by the hug exchanged between victim and criminal.
Ray was very merciful. He had forgiven Casey for Casey's conduct, and that is rare. Many times, victims that have lost tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars, having that just severe emotional devastation, the lack of financial stability, an uncertain future. Often there's anger, there is hatred, there's vitriol in this one. What impressed me was Ray's resilience throughout the process, and that Ray had on that journey had arrived at a place where he could be heard and really wish the best for Casey. And part of that could have been to Casey's youth on it, but really wanted him to be better.
It's amazing. And Ray described to me a scene during the sentencing where he and Casey actually hugged, and people around him were mystified by that, but he meant it.
He really did. There was a connection, and part of me as a federal prosecutor is always concerned when someone has that instant rapport, that connection with a fraudster. Is this something that they obviously use, they feel emotionally connected, and in this case, obviously an investment of considerable magnitude on that part? Is this someone who's exploiting someone for their own gain? But in this case, the path that Ray took to get to the point where, yes, he was financially assaulted in this scam, but then had the ability to accept that and look to move on, and that power to forgive. One thing for financial fraud victims is the ability to have some grace. The ability for fraud victims often are blaming themselves. They feel that they're stupid. They feel that they really beat themselves up over it. And the idea is that no, the fraudsters are sophisticated. There's a script. They use psychological manipulation and techniques on it. And for Ray to have the grace to forgive Casey is in a way forgiving himself and the ability to move on, which is huge. It really is. These types of cases, victims can get stuck in the inability to move forward. And the ability for Ray to do that, it's rare at that point in a courtroom to see that happen, but it's certainly so much for the better for Ray and for other victims as well.
You are saying such a mouthful here. That's remarkable. This idea that the hardest person of all to forgive is yourself, but if you can forgive the criminal, it's easier to forgive yourself, and then you can move past it and get on with the rest of your life. That's remarkable.
Yeah, one technique is to write a letter of forgiveness and to forgive yourself. And then at the end of writing that letter, do something memorable with it, burn it up, throw it away, close that chapter, and allow yourself the ability to move on.
Brian's got a lot of wisdom when it comes to scams.
One thing about investment scams is that they are really targeted for people. If people think that their future is up to themselves, that it's based on hard work and determination, if people who think that they have an internal locus of control, investment scams are for them. And scammers know that and will target those people, as opposed to others who might think that their future is up to fate and that whatever happens will happen, and that there's an external locus of control. For those victims, lottery scams are specially tailored for them, whether it's the Irish sweepstakes or the Jamaican lottery. So in Ray's case, having that investment fraud scheme tailored and directed to him, for him to be able to go ahead and be able to move forward is huge.
It's so interesting the way you put that, however. We talk a lot on The Perfect Scam about how, first of all, anyone can be a victim, but also there's a scam for everyone based on who you are and where you are in life and whatnot. And that there are different kinds of people who might be targeted either by a lottery scam or by an investment scam. That's fascinating.
Yes.
The most important part of these conversations, of course, is what takeaways you want listeners to have. So when somebody hears you talk about this situation, when somebody hears Ray, what do you want them to learn from it?
Anytime that someone is offered an opportunity to invest, it's such a good idea to talk about it with another person, whether that be another financial advisor, an accountant, a banker, any trusted person. That's important, always to have someone else's input and guidance. Investment fraud is tricky. Some of the resources available would include going to FINRA, and FINRA is the Financial Industry Regulatory Authority, and one can look up a particular broker or investment advisor or a dealer, or in your own individual state to look up. And by doing so, to look up and ask. The other thing to be aware of is anything regarding, is this investment opportunity, is it regulated? And in terms of wine or whiskey, or even today, cryptocurrency, those aren't regulated. So as investors, there's absolutely much more risk involved in that. And then if someone does invest and they turns out to be a scam, the most important thing is to report it. Sadly, many older Americans feel shame and embarrassment and fail to report it. So to be able to report that scam, and whether it be to your local police, whether it be to the Federal Trade Commission, whether it be to the Better Business Bureau, any reporting of it, including IC3.gov, the Internet Crime Complaint Center, allows for authorities to investigate, and they were able to go ahead and link up these bad actors, and whether they're domestic or whether they're international, as part of transnational crime. That's the most important thing.
Sometimes it's hard to know where to report the crime to. You mentioned state securities regulators, for example. I don't know that most people would know that there's a state office they could complain to for something like this.
Yes, yes. And there is an overlap on some services between federal and state, and you would simply check with your local state. All financial institutions are regulated, but typically every state has a division of securities. So if someone's selling stocks, bonds, annuities, or like in this case, a commodity, there will be a state agency. And simply by consulting with another person or checking with another entity can find out a little bit more about the investment. Is this legitimate? Have there been complaints about this broker? What are the risks that are involved? There's no 100% way to make sure, but there are ways to at least reduce the risk. There's no way to prevent a dishonest broker, but the ability to talk to others and to look at the state or federal regulators can help lessen or mitigate that risk.
Ray is trying to move on with his life, of course, still reeling from the theft of $300,000, hoping he'll see some of that restitution Casey was ordered to pay, but not holding his breath. He's now free in the UK, right?
I believe so. But if there are any international agreements that felons are free, but they had to make compensation. I did speak to Brian a couple of weeks ago, and I said, has anybody heard from Casey? And Brian said, no. I don't know. I'm going to call him again because he's very approachable. And if I call him at a time when he's not available, I leave a message and he'll call me typically the same day, even on his way home from work. He will call me.
Wow.
He's that kind of guy.
The pain he feels from the crime lives on, as does the impact.
The immediate emotion is fear, not for my own physical well-being, but for my financial well-being. I do a lot of domestic and international welfare. I've been to Ukraine several times, helping out with construction and renovation and food distribution. So I give a lot of my money to charity. I've worked for the kitchen, what's it called? Anyway, International Food Service, and donate money and time and labor to different organizations. So the biggest thing, my biggest concern, because I'm fine. I wasn't planning on buying a yacht. World Central Kitchen.
You mean Jose Andres's thing, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
I volunteered with them a couple of times in both Poland and, mostly Poland because they pulled out of Ukraine, but I've worked with them in Poland, World Central Kitchen. And so part of my biggest disappointment is not being able to help out as much as I had hoped to. And I can pretty much guarantee that all the money that I lost would have gone towards those kinds of organizations.
That's just a terrible thing. So whoever stole that money, they literally stole it out of the mouths of people who really need help, right?
Yeah, it would probably cost lives. Again, I did some renovation of bombed buildings over in Ukraine, and that's the biggest hurt is, oh my God, I can't do everything that I've been wanting to do and planning to do.
Wow.
So again, it puts a ding in my own personal lifestyle, but not terribly impactful. But just, I'm the kind of person that I like to give. I like to give away, and there's less to give away.
And he's left feeling more distrustful than ever.
So my investment in whiskey was an attempt to make sure, because as my income goes down as I get older, I wanted to have other sources of income. And that's what the investments were for. So it doesn't affect me or my willingness to give or my trust in other people that I'm giving to. Yes, I'm more distrustful of anybody that comes to me with an offer, but it just makes me sad that I can't help. So that's the most impactful thing, is the people that I could have helped that I won't be able to.
What sort of advice do you have for people who might be listening to your story?
I would say, some people operate more on intuition, but do everything you can to inform your intuition and to inform yourself as a good investor. Do as many visits as you can. I mean, all kinds of investments. This one is not regulated by the U.S. government. I mean, most of our stock market activity is regulated by the government, and I trust my government. But yeah, do all the vetting, and visit, look at people, go to the site. If they're making something, go to the factory. $300,000 is a lot of money for a lot of people, and so don't invest any more than you can afford to lose, which is an adage that we hear all the time.
Sure.
And do all the research that you can, meet the people, look them in the eye, and yeah.
When it comes to whiskey investments, it turns out there are some regulations Ray didn't know about, designed to protect investors. And did you ever get any kind of statements or receipts or any kind of paperwork on these things?
Yes, and that's the other thing that people investing, particularly in whiskey, need to be in the lookout for. There's something called a delivery order. I never got one, and they never sent me anything close to what was a industry-wide accepted proof of purchase. They did send me invoices and paid statements, which anybody could make up, which apparently they were doing. But I never received what was called a delivery order, which is a very official government certified document stating that this is your barrel, this is the number of the barrel, and hang on to it until you sell your barrel.
Sounds kind of like a car title.
Yes. Yep. Something very official.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
I was too naive to know.
But you didn't know that existed at the time, right?
I was told that, I'd went online and Googled for whiskey investments. And there are a number of, I would say, reputable teachers, professionals who can warn you of, because they don't want the whole industry to get a bad name. So there's plenty of information out there should you avail yourself of it. So doing a lot of research, even though I thought I had, did not safeguard my investment.
And let's just make sure to say this. Any investments in these kinds of industries are very risky. You shouldn't consider them unless you do a lot of research, and even then, know that you could lose all your money. Most people should just stick to straightforward investments like those available in a 401k or IRA. And also, most of all, you had also said something about cold calls.
Yes, cold calls we're told, are an indication, that if they're reaching out to you instead of you reaching out to them, don't respond.
If you didn't do the reaching out, just don't answer the phone or return the call. That's the best, simplest advice. For The Perfect Scam, I'm Bob Sullivan. If you have been targeted by a scam or fraud, you are not alone. Call the AARP Fraud Watch Network helpline at 877-908-3360. Their trained fraud specialists can provide you with free support and guidance on what to do next. Our email address at The Perfect Scam is theperfectscampodcast@aarp.org, and we want to hear from you. If you've been the victim of a scam or you know someone who has, and you'd like us to tell their story, write to us. That address again is theperfectscampodcast@aarp.org. Thank you to our team of Scam Busters, Associate Producer Annalee Embry, Researcher Becky Dodson, Executive Producer Julie Getz, and our audio engineer and sound designer Julio Gonzalez. Be sure to find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. For AARP's The Perfect Scam, I'm Bob Sullivan.